Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Legal Landscape. My name is Wendy Huang. I am the Director of Legal Services here at the WRA. And today we're going to be talking about the right of first refusal. So thanks again for joining me this morning. Okay, so if there are any questions that you have or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. But let's get started. Okay. So the basics. So you've probably heard the term right of first refusal. So essentially what this does is it gives the potential purchaser, right, the holder of the right of first refusal, the first opportunity to buy a property on the same terms as another purchaser. So let's say that the holder of the right of first refusal has that right of first refusal with the property owner of a home, and then the owner ends up listing their property. And then a buyer comes along and puts in an offer. At that point, that holder of the right of first refusal can decide, hey, I'm going to buy this property and I'm going to buy it on the same terms, conditions, price, right? Everything the same as that buyer who submitted their offer. So typically, a right of first refusal is recorded. We like to have it recorded just so anyone is put on notice, hey, there's someone else who has an interest in this property and has the right to buy this property, right? However, they don't always have to be recorded. So I've gotten calls from licensees who have said, hey, this property has a right of first refusal. Seller has shown it to me. But it didn't come up in a title search or it wasn't recorded. Is this still legitimate? And the answer is yes. So a right of first refusal doesn't have to be recorded to be enforceable. We like to see that it's recorded, but it doesn't have to be. So again, a right of first refusal gives that holder the right to purchase the property on the same terms and conditions as the buyer. And this presumes, right, that that holder gets a copy of the offer of that buyer to decide, hey, am I going to match it or am I going to let someone else buy the property? So again, because this right of first refusal is a personal contractual right? It's a document between the holder and the property owner. It typically won't run with the land. So even if it's recorded, it won't run with the land unless that document specifically says that it's going to bind any successors or heirs. So if a holder of a right of first refusal ends up passing, right, typically that's going to end with them. Okay, so you might be wondering, what's my role in this? As an agent, what do I do when I know that there's a right of first refusal? So I always say licensees should never interpret the language on a right of first refusal. So this is a legal document, right? It's not a WB form, it's not a WRA form. Typically, this is just a contract that's written up, probably by an attorney. But a licensee should never, ever try to interpret this. So if a seller or a holder of a right of first refusal asks you, hey, what does this mean? Or how do I implement this? Or how do I exercise my right? You can't tell them how to do that. You have to refer them to legal counsel. So in that example I put where it wasn't recorded, right? The seller ended up asking, hey, is this enforceable? What do I do with this? Or does it run out? And I had to tell the agent, I know that the seller is going to you with questions and you're the expert, right, in the real estate transaction. But because this is unique, right, each right of first refusal is unique and specific to that holder and that property owner. You have to refer them to legal counsel. And then their private attorneys can say, hey, this is enforceable, this isn't, or this is how you exercise it, or this expired, or whatever else, right? So there is no uniform right of first refusal, like I said. And because of that, it's a legal document between the two, and licensees should not be interpreting that. What a licensee does have to do, though, is disclose. So if the seller says at the listing or at some point says to the listing agent, hey, I have this document and it's a right of first refusal, At that point, the licensee knows, right? So if the licensee knows about this right of first refusal, they have to disclose that to potential purchasers in writing in a timely manner. So, in a timely manner kind of presumes that if the licensee knows, the licensee has to tell any prospective buyer before that buyer ends up submitting an offer, because that's going to affect their decision making, right? And this is actually in the Wisconsin Administrative Code, this duty to disclose the existence of a right of first refusal. And then after that disclosure is made, and the buyer ends up deciding, hey, I'm going to still write an offer, I'll take my chances. And let's say they submit that offer, then the licensee may share a copy of that buyer's offer with the holder of the right of first refusal. So you might be saying, ooh, that kind of is a red flag for me. I always was taught never to share another buyer's offer with a prospective buyer. And you're right, in most cases, almost all cases, you have that duty of confidentiality and you have that duty of confidentiality of offers. But in this case, the administrative code does have an exception. So if the buyer ends up submitting an offer knowing that there's a right of first refusal and you made that disclosure in writing in a timely manner, at that point, you can take that buyer's offer and submit a copy to the holder of the right of first refusal. Because again, that presumes that the holder is going to be able to see those terms and decide, hey, am I going to buy this or am I going to let another buyer purchase it instead? Okay. So there was a recent change to the administrative code, and this went into effect this past weekend on March 1st. Some other things changed, but right here we're just going to be talking about the right of first refusal provision. So you can see on the slide here that it does say that a licensee can share that right of first refusal, that they have that disclosure obligation. But then what was added is underlined there on the slide. So licensees are not responsible for implementation of any right of first refusal terms. So that means that even though a licensee discloses that information, discloses that there is a right of first refusal, may deliver a copy of that buyer's offer to the holder, the licensee is not responsible for saying, hey, there's the right of first refusal and there's another buyer and this is how you're supposed to exercise that, right? So a licensee is not responsible, is not legally responsible to tell a holder, hey, this is how you implement it, or seller, hey, this is what you're supposed to do, to tell the holder of the right of first refusal. So this was changed just because I think there were a lot of questions about, hey, we know that there's a right of first refusal. We have to tell them, obviously, but now we're getting questions about, hey, how do I exercise this? So I'm just going to take a quick look in the chat to see if there's any questions. Okay, so yeah, a licensee is not required to implement it. They're not required to tell the holder, hey, this property is now listed as for sale. Their only duty is to disclose to prospective buyers that there is a right of first refusal. The seller may have obligations per that right of first refusal to notify the holder, right, that it's for sale, but the licensee is not required to do that. And the licensee isn't required to tell the parties, hey, the holder of the right of first refusal is supposed to send a written notice exercising their right. Any kind of implementation or enforceability questions that the parties may have, that's going to be referred to their own private legal counsel. Because like I said, each right of first refusal is going to be different. There's no uniform form, there's no uniform language. The basics is just, hey, the holder gets to purchase the property and match the terms of another buyer's offer. So even though you have that disclosure obligation, you aren't required to tell the parties exactly how the right of first refusal works or how they exercise it or how it's implemented. All right. So I'm going to take a quick look here at the chat to see if there's anything. And again, if you have any questions, feel free. I know I'm kind of going through this information fast. And for those who may be just joining us, I know sometimes we have latecomers. I'll kind of just break down again what we've discussed. We're talking about the right of first refusal. It gives the potential purchaser the right to match the terms of another buyer's offer. This presumes that that holder is going to get a copy of another buyer's offer. And a licensee does have that exception in the administrative code to share the offer. I know typically we say don't share one buyer's offer with another potential buyer, which is true, except for in the case where you're getting one buyer's offer and handing it to a holder of the right of first refusal. And always make sure that you refer buyers to legal counsel. And let's see, we have a question here. We have a couple questions here. So thanks for chatting with me. So Patty says, when you convey the offer, should you redact the buyer's names? So again, when you convey the offer, should you redact the buyer's names? So yeah, I think because of other confidential reasons, although the holder gets to see the terms, right? So like purchase price, see that there's a financing commitment contingency or an inspection contingency or whatever else, right? The other information like the buyer's name, if there's other personal information that the buyer has in there, like their email address or something, that's not pertinent for the holder to match the offer, right? So I think it would be a good idea to redact that personal information. So the buyer's names, buyer's email address, if they end up putting their phone number or something, or their physical address, right? If mail is a authorized form of delivery. I think just redacting any personal information is a good idea, just because the holder doesn't need that information to match the terms. They really just need the terms of the offer of what the buyer is willing the terms of which the buyer is willing to purchase the property. And they can decide, hey, I'm going to match that. This seems like a fair price. I'm okay with these contingencies. And that's going to inform their decision. But they don't need that other buyer's email address, for example. That's a great question, though. Okay, so Steph is asking, for disclosure, would a disclosure of material adverse fact form be appropriate? So yeah, I think any disclosure of material adverse fact form, it could be an email. The administrative code just requires it to be in writing. It doesn't say specifically how, but I think a disclosure of material adverse fact form is an easy way to do it. And we have that form in zip form and on our PDF forms library. I think some people don't realize that the WRA has all the WRA forms and WB forms on our website. You have to be logged in to access it, but it is a nice list that you can download all our forms. And then obviously if you have zip form, it's also going to be there. So the WRA's disclosure material adverse fact form is something that you can use. Again, it just has to be in writing. The administrative code doesn't say it necessarily what form except for in writing. So that's a good question as well. Let's see if we have anything else. And I'll take just a few seconds just because I know we're going through this information and you might be thinking about a question, especially based on the other questions that have come in. I think another thing that to keep in mind is it needs to be in writing and it needs to be made timely. And sometimes you might not find that a right of first refusal is on the property until you've already listed it and maybe you've already had buyers submit offers. But once you know, it needs to be made timely. And again, the rationale is the ideal is that you would tell a prospective buyer before they submit an offer because that's going to impact their decision. However, sometimes that's not possible. Maybe the seller forgot or maybe it didn't come up until after maybe there's already submitted offers. And then at that point, you still would have to disclose, right? You'd have to disclose, hey, now there's a right of first refusal, or there was a right of first refusal, and now that I've become aware of it, I'm disclosing that to you. And you might say to that prospective buyer, that buyer who submitted their offer, hey, I we just found out this information now, right? Because you don't want to have any type of misrepresentation that you were hiding it and waiting for them to submit an offer before disclosing that, right? So you might just have to explain, hey, we just found that out. This disclosure isn't being made in bad faith. We weren't just lying in wait for you to submit your offer. But again, once you know of it, you should disclose that in writing. And that's why we have that discussion with the seller and a condition on the condition report, right? If the seller knows, sometimes consumers don't know or they don't remember, right? But we kind of try to have that discussion beforehand. Okay, another question. As a listing agent, and since you said right of first refusal doesn't have to be recorded, what would happen if the seller or the agent didn't know? Would the agent be liable? So yeah, I think that's kind of going off of what I was just talking about, where let's say that the seller didn't, well, seller should know, although we all know that sometimes, if it was if it was entered into a while ago, seller forgot or didn't realize exactly what that was, right? Not all sellers are trying to act in bad faith. In fact, I think most are trying to do what they're supposed to be doing. But because of that, the listing agent didn't know, and it wasn't recorded. It didn't come up in a title search. So listing agent didn't know. They didn't have any reason to believe that there was. I would say there's a good argument here that the agent isn't liable, right? You can't disclose something that you didn't know, but that's why documentation is key to say, hey, we found out that this right of first refusal, was a thing, or I found out, on this day, this time, because that holder came around or their attorney ended up coming around and saying, hey, there's this right of first refusal we have. So I think at that point, just keep documenting, hey, this is when I found out about it. This is when I made that timely disclosure, because I know I have that duty to disclose. And then obviously you'll want to talk to your supervising broker and say, hey, this is what happened, and I don't know exactly what this is going to mean for us or our transaction. At that point, especially if there's already an accepted offer and the holder of the right of first refusal is coming back around and saying, hey, why are you selling this to someone else? I had the right to match those terms and that offer, and I wanted to purchase the property. At that point, all you can really do is refer the parties to legal counsel and talk to your supervising broker. You might want to consult your firm's private legal counsel and contact your errors and omissions. But again, it's hard to say because you just can't disclose what you don't know. All right. And okay, sorry I missed your question, Candace. So can you give an example of a situation when this applies? So let's say that I think we typically see this with neighbors, for example. So let's say that, and this doesn't always have to be residential property. Let's say that two adjoining neighbors have property and it's land. Let's say it's land. And the neighbor ends up building a house, and they know that their neighbor has the vacant land. They haven't done anything with it. It's just land that they own. And they say, hey, I might want to purchase this land if you ever decide to sell, because I need more room for my family, or I'm going to use it for recreational land, or maybe I'm going to build, another structure for my my house, whatever the case. But a lot of times they end up knowing each other, and they say, hey, if you end up wanting to sell your land, I'm going to buy it from you. So the parties end up entering into a right of first refusal because let's say the seller or the property owner of that land is not ready at this point. They're like, I don't know if I'm ever going to sell, but sure, you'll get, the first opportunity, you'll get first dibs, right, to purchase the property if I decide to sell. And that's why we always say it doesn't have to be recorded, but it probably helps for it to be recorded, just because let's say that it's not until years down the line that the owner of that land decides to sell. When it's recorded, at least that will, put any agent who's listing it on notice, hey, there's this right of first refusal here. And obviously if it's a neighbor, hopefully they would be able to see a for sale sign being put up, or they're good enough neighbors that they end up talking about these things. But a lot of times you'll see something like that where maybe an adjoining neighbor wants to purchase the property for their own use at some point. I think that's an easy example. Okay, we have a couple more questions here. So Patty says, we have some condo complexes that have them but don't do anything about it. Basically, the HOA is not buying properties anymore. So yeah, I think this does come up. So in Patty's question, she said, in a condo association, for example, has a right of first refusal to purchase any unit or all of the units, right? They have a right of first refusal with each unit owner. So they have the first opportunity to buy that unit back from the owner when the owner decides to sell. And then Patty's saying, well, the association basically isn't going to be buying those units anymore. What happens? So nothing. I mean, even though there's that right of first refusal, the agent still has a duty to disclose, right? Has to tell prospective buyers. And then the unit owner will have to tell, if there's that obligation, right, the condo association, hey, I'm selling and you're the holder of this right of first refusal. Presumably there's something in there saying that the seller has to notify the holder. But if the holder doesn't want to buy the property, then nothing really happens. The disclosures are still made. The holder just doesn't exercise their right. They don't need to waive that necessarily. Certainly, I think for the unit owners, the seller's comfort, they may want to get their attorneys to write something or have the association write something saying, hey, I'm not going to pursue this right of first refusal for 123 Main Street, Unit 5, right? I think getting something in writing is always the best case, but technically the association wouldn't have to do anything if they're not going to exercise it, if they're not going to implement it. Because again, if they were to implement it, they would have to implement it according to the actual terms of the right of first refusal. And a licensee at that point kind of just stays out of it. They don't tell the association how to do it. They don't tell the seller, hey, this is what the association is supposed to be doing to implement it. You're kind of hands off at that point after you make your disclosures. So that's a good question. If the holder doesn't want to exercise it, what happens? They just don't exercise it, right? And if the seller wants to see something in writing from the holder saying, hey, I'm not going to exercise that, that's certainly something that could happen, but they should be referred to legal counsel about that. All right, a couple more questions here. So best practice, a right of first refusal should be referenced in the listing contract. Where in the listing contract would you enter that information? I think it doesn't hurt, right? I think having all that information in the listing contract doesn't hurt, because the listing contract is a contract between the seller and the listing firm. Just acknowledging it doesn't add anything, but it also doesn't hurt, right? So if the listing firm and the seller want to put, there's a right of first refusal on the property, that's fine. At least there's kind of an evidence of, hey, we talked about this, we put it in our listing contract. Regardless of if it's in the listing contract or not, the agent still has that duty to disclose. But I don't think it hurts. I think adding that information is never going to hurt in a listing contract. All right, another question here. We only have a few minutes, so I'll try to get to these. So what if the seller didn't know and a title search wasn't done beforehand, only after submitting the offer? Is the agent responsible for knowing about the right of first refusal? So no. So again, in that situation, there was a right of first refusal, wasn't recorded, seller didn't know, forgot, whatever the case is, or title search wasn't done. They only became aware of it, again, after an offer was submitted. Let's say because the holder comes back around. The agent wouldn't be responsible for knowing about it. An agent has the duty to disclose when they know about it. A listing agent has to inspect the property before listing the property, but that doesn't include investigating the property, right? So this comes up with, septic or zoning or whatever else, right? So the agent isn't just required by statute to find all that information out. They aren't required to try to dig up a right of first refusal if they have no reason to believe that it's there. If they become aware of it, that's when the disclosure is triggered. Another question here. If you are an agent drafting an offer on a property that has the right of first refusal, do we need to state that the offer is contingent upon the right of first refusal not being exercised? That's a great question. So again, the question was, if you're a cooperating agent, if you're an agent working with the buyer, and you become aware of that right of first refusal, should you make the offer contingent upon that right of first refusal not being exercised? I think it's a good idea. You don't have to, right? You draft according to the buyer's instructions. If they're like, I don't really want to do that. But if you're like, hey, it's not a bad idea, I think you certainly can do that. So if you want to put, this offer is contingent upon the right of first refusal not being exercised, let's say they want to make sure that their earnest money is returned, they can put something in there saying, if the right of first refusal is exercised by X date, earnest money shall be returned to buyer, right? So I think preparing the buyer for that situation where a right of first refusal might be exercised, I think that's not a bad idea. I think it prepares the buyer for that possibility, and kind of lays out exactly what's going to happen when it is exercised by that holder, if and when it's exercised by that holder. So the parties know, hey, buyer's going to get their earnest money back. They need to know whether it's going to be exercised by such and such date, because obviously if it's going to be exercised and buyer wants to look for other properties, they should be prepared, hey, by this deadline, we'll know. Okay, so this most recent question, last question here is, what if multiple offers come in at the same time? So let's say that we have that right of first refusal, multiple offers come in at the same time. Technically, the holder can exercise their right of first refusal, and they're going to match the term essentially that the seller would have picked. So if multiple offers come at the same time, presumably they would have to match any and all of those offers, but the only one that truly matters is the one that the seller would have picked or was going to pick, because that's the best offer. That's the offer that they would have sold the property. That's the buyer they would have sold the property to. So that holder is going to match the terms of the actual purchaser, or the purchaser that the seller was going to go with. But that's a good question as well. In this market, especially where we're seeing multiple offers on a property, what happens with the holder of the right of first refusal when there's multiple offers? And practically speaking, they're going to match the offer terms that are likely most favorable that the seller was going to go with. That is when multiple offers come in. Okay, can you put a time right there in the offer, like 5 days? So I'm assuming you're asking about, can you put a timeline in for when the offer is going to be contingent on it being exercised? So you can, right? I think it's hard to say though, because that might not match the timeline for the right of first refusal. So the right of first refusal, the timeline could be within 20 days of it being listed, within 20 days of them receiving their first offer. And if you put in an offer saying, hey, this offer is contingent upon the right of first refusal holder exercising it within 5 days, you can do that. But if the holder actually has 20 days, you're kind of in a conundrum. But certainly you could put 5 days, and then that makes it shorter, and the buyer can just say, okay, if they've exercised or if they haven't exercised it, I'm just going to terminate. So that's another thing you want to consider. Can the buyer just terminate regardless of what happens? That's something you're going to want to ask your buyer about. Okay, so We're at 9:30, but I'm going to ask this. I'm going to answer this last question here. So it doesn't have to be accepted with a bump out for the right of first refusal. You just send one that the seller will pick. Um, yeah, so the offer that comes in, it doesn't have to have a bump, right? It could be any term. Um, but practically speaking, the seller's only going to sell the property to one buyer, right? So you would send the offer terms of the one that the seller's going to pick because that's the property that the right of first refusal holder is going to match the terms of the offer. Um, so it doesn't need to have a bump for you to be able to share that because, again, the Wisconsin Administrative Code allows a licensee to share that buyer's offer with the holder. Have you ever come across a situation where a seller accepted an offer and then learned? So yeah, I have come across that. I didn't learn about the outcome, but again, at that point, I just had to say, hey, this is kind of out of your hands, listing agent. You just have to refer the parties to legal counsel about what the implications are for the seller regarding the fact that they might have forgotten about the right of first refusal and they ended up accepting a property without that right of first refusal being exercised, or the holder being able to exercise that because they didn't know that it was for sale. There might be penalties. That holder might be able to sue the seller because they breached that contract. I don't know what ended up happening or the consequences for the seller, but I think that's something that the holder certainly could pursue is legal damages, saying, hey, you were supposed to sell to me. I was supposed to match the terms. You ended up selling to someone else. All right. Well, because it's 9:30, I will let you all go, but I want to thank you for coming along with me and breaking down the right of first refusal. Thank you to everyone who put in a comment or a question. It definitely makes it more interactive and informative, and I'm able to share practical knowledge, right, that applies to your situation. So thanks again. This was Your Legal Landscape.